Live streaming on YouTube. I'm
Yeah.
terrified. Thank you, John. You're
We're gonna
also.
get.
Is that better? I think that's better, right? There's a little bit more.
No.
What?
Maybe one.
All right. I'm a little bit more illuminated now.
Hi everyone, and welcome to Politics and Prose Live. We're here tonight with Colin Dickey and Michelle Legro, and we're really excited for tonight's event. But before we get started, I just have some quick housekeeping for you. The first thing is that if you look in the chat, I've posted a link to tonight's book, The Unidentified, and we really encourage everyone to purchase a copy of the book. It's a great way to support our author and also to support an independent bookstore like Politics and Prose. Secondly, we have devoted the latter portion of the event tonight to your audience questions, and to ask a question, in which we highly encourage, there's a Q&A button at the bottom of your screens. So if you go there and click on it, you can ask your question, and we're going to try to get to as many of those as we can. So with that out of the way, it is my honor to introduce Colin Dickey. He is a curator of strange stories and a tour guide of mysterious phenomena. He's the author of the books Cranioclepty, The Afterlives of Saints, and Ghostland, and he is also the co-editor of the Morbid Anatomy Anthology, as well as a member of the Order of the Good Death. In his latest book, The Unidentified, Dickey explores our fascination with unexplainable mysteries, like the Loch Ness Monster, UFOs, and the lost city of Atlantis. As the world becomes smaller and more knowable, belief in the unprovable and the irrational continues to grow. We are, as Dickey explains, all trying to find meaning in a world stripped of wonder. Tonight, Dickey will be in conversation with Michelle Legro, the features editor for Medium's magazine of politics, culture, and power. So, Colin and Michelle, the screen is yours.
Cool, thanks.
Hi, Colin. How are you?
I'm doing well, Michelle. How are you? You told me to bring Negroni, so I did. So I hope that's
good.
Cool. Yeah.
I would need a Negroni. If I could have one made for me, that would be amazing. That's great. Thank you. Colin, I noticed you've been wearing this hat in a lot of your events. Can you tell me a little bit about your hat?
This is my new look. This is my Gone Squatching hat. This came courtesy of my brother in Portland, Oregon, whom I said, please acquire me a hat, and him being a good guy, he came through. So yeah, so this is my new summer 2020 look, and I'm obviously very pleased with myself. We'll just say that.
Clearly you are. So we've been friends for a long time, and I wanted to talk a little bit about the journey from your last book to this book. Your last book, Ghostland, I think it's just an amazing book about haunted places in America and the stories we tell ourselves. And I wanted to find out a little bit about how you came to the Unidentified from Ghostland, and sort of what you wanted to achieve with it, because it feels like there's a really good thread between the two books about sort of the mythologies that we've created in American life, and how we use them to console ourselves in tough times. Just tell me a little bit about the shift from one book to another, and how you came to write The Unidentified.
Sure, yeah. So right, as you mentioned, my last book was on ghosts, and specifically haunted places. Trying to find the right angle for my face to be properly framed. Anyways, so it was a kind of history, kind of a cultural history of the United States through haunted places, and sort of looking specifically at not, do ghosts exist, do ghosts not exist, but sort of how the stories that we told about ghosts reflected aspects of American history that maybe we couldn't necessarily, or we didn't want to access in other ways. So like kind of the textbook example, I guess, that I focused a lot about in the book is this idea of like the haunted Indian burial ground. This idea that like, particularly white Americans have this sort of suppressed or unable to face this, this sort of guilt and anxiety over the fact that, like the land that they live on is like literally stolen. And so one of the ways that gets expressed is through these kind of ghost stories, the haunted Indian burial ground, this idea that like the land that the beautiful, perfect suburban house is built on is actually, belongs to somebody else. And so, so that was kind of what I did with Ghostland. And with this book, what happened was, quite literally, after the 2016 election, I was, like a lot of people, sort of like, we were sort of awash in these conspiracy theories, and a lot of the conversation was about the way in which they were motivated by social media and Facebook sort of algorithms sort of spreading conspiracy theories. And I think that's totally valid. I think that's absolutely a real thing. But I was also struck by the fact that a lot of these conspiracy theories predated social media, and I wanted to take a step back. And I want, as much as I want, people to be aware of the fact that social media is really driving this, to not see that as like the silver bullet explanation of what is going on here. So I decided to kind of take a step back, and literally what happened is I was talking about this on social media, and one of the things I threw out there to suggest that this predated the 2016 election was the fact that at the time 14% of Americans believed, according to surveys, believed in the existence of Bigfoot, which was, if you do the math, is something like 42 million people. And so that was the moment I was like, oh, okay, this is actually these beliefs sort of transcend the kind of conspiracy theories of the moment, but they also are a lot more culturally significant, I think, than we give them credit. I grew up on stories of like Bigfoot and the Loch Ness monster and UFOs and all that stuff, and I love that stuff, but I kind of in the back of my head assumed that they had started to die out as a belief system. And so sort of once I started doing the numbers and realized that these were still very much part of American culture, I was like, well, maybe it's worth figuring out where they come from. So that's kind of how I got from one to the other.
I was really fascinated to basically sort of talking with you about like the origins of, in order to create a pseudoscience, you first have to create a science. And a lot of this comes from essentially the Enlightenment and the creation of the scientific method. And I was super fascinated to sort of hear you talk about like that, and sort of like the rise, basically when we have the rise of the scientific method and basically in the creation of science, you then have the parallel creation of alternative science and conspiracy theories. Can you kind of talk a little bit about like that time period and the rise of these two factions?
Yeah, so right. And again, like, one of the things about ghost stories is that, belief in ghosts like transcends time and culture. Like every culture has its ghosts, every culture has its ghost stories. It's very stable. The stuff that I ended up focusing on in this book felt very historically grounded in the last 150 years in a way that I wasn't expecting and kind of struck me. So when I set out to sort of try and understand this stuff, I tried to do a kind of long kind of historical reach into this. And one of the things that seemed to be the case is that starting in the 18th century, but really in the 19th century, there is a shift from, there's a separation between religion and science, where they start to kind of sift out from one another, and they start to become two different ways of looking at the world. And both of them have this kind of totalizing sort of explanation for the world, like for both religion and science. I mean, obviously they overlap and they're complementary in a lot of ways, but both of them sort of offer an explanation for the world that's complete, and that anything that can happen in the world can fit in one of these two systems. And by the end of the 19th century, they are really sort of prominently on the rise. And that is also the moment at which you start to get belief in Atlantis. You start to get belief in cryptids. Eventually you'll get belief, in UFOs and flying saucers. And what had occurred to me was that a lot of this seemed to be arising in reaction to the kind of solidifying of science into a kind of institutional, pursuit, rather than, the sort of splendid gentleman alone in his study with a, microscope, sort of doing these things. That like suddenly you had to be part of an institution, you had to get a PhD, you had to do all these things. And so the rise in this kind of pseudoscience that became the backbone of the book happened as almost a reaction to that kind of gradual professionalization of the scientific method in a lot of ways.
You had a really fascinating just statistic in there that was like the first PhD in America wasn't available until like 1861, but then it wasn't even more widely available until at least the 1870s, 1880s. And I actually hadn't realized that basically the PhD is barely 100 years old. And that like this basically creates a new sort of like stratification of education, the professionalism of education. So that was even just like fascinating to me to realize how recent that is.
Yeah, right. And it's a weird side history that I was like, I want to write about the history of PhDs, but I'm like, okay, Colin, you have to stay focused on the book,
Slow
because like
down a bit.
you can't have a 30-page digression into the history of higher ed. But yeah, it's really true that the model that we know, I mean, it comes from Germany, but it gets imported into the United States around this time, and it starts with Harvard and the Ivy Leagues, and then it sort of spreads out. But there is this gradual recognition. And again, it's not entirely, malevolent. I mean, you think about, the first half of the 19th century, pretty much any 18-year-old could go to medical school and pay for medical school of varying qualities and walk out with a degree-ish to practice medicine. And so the professionalization that happens at that time is really an attempt to kind of institute some standards. That's when you get like, professional organizations as well. This idea that if you're going to be a doctor, you got to belong to, an association of doctors, and we all sort of agree to certain standards. So that all becomes professionalized, and as a side result, you have people like Ignatius Donnelly, the guy who writes the book on Atlantis, who is basically like, I don't need a PhD in archaeology. I just need some moxie and a book, some books on my shelf, and I can prove to you that Atlantis is real.
Yeah, I was thinking a lot about how access to education affects the proliferation of conspiracy theories, and sort of when I kind of wanted your thoughts on this, of just sort of when there is wide access to education, like let's say sort of like post-war, like after the GI Bill, versus like a period now as like education is becoming more walled off and like way too expensive, and just how does sort of like the rise and fall in access of education like affect how people are drawn to conspiracy theories?
It's interesting. I don't know how much of a direct correlation there is, because in a lot of ways, I mean, okay, so a lot of this stuff you would think now, given what we know about technology and science and biology and, the planets and all this stuff, we should be able to, like, we don't have evidence of these things. You would think that these beliefs would die down. And the fact that they don't really suggests to me that it's less about education or sort of access to knowledge, and it's more about what these things are doing for people's belief system. So like in the late 70s, there's a really popular guy at the time is Eric von Daniken, the guy who writes Chariots of the Gods, which is the first book to suggest that the pyramids were made by aliens, right? So he publishes that book in 1968. And it's a bestseller. It's like, one of those, like, the thing you buy at Tower Records and that kind of stuff, although that reference is maybe going to go over the head of many people here if you're not overturning.
Tower that's made of records? What's a record? What's a
right,
tower?
exactly. What is a Tower of Records? Anyways, so it's pretty popular, and it's annoying to archaeologists who are like, no, we know quite definitively that the pyramids were built by the Egyptians. But they're in the late 70s, they actually did a study where they found out that freshmen who came in believing in Eric von Daniken's ancient astronauts theory, and then majored in archaeology, would still more or less graduate believing the same thing. That being exposed to like the methodology of archaeology actually wasn't enough to dissuade them of this belief system. So there's this real way in which what I kept finding again and again is that this stuff is really, it is operating on a more kind of fundamental and primal level than it is about like what is or isn't truth and what do we know, I guess.
I've been thinking a lot about sort of classic style conspiracy theories like UFOs, Bigfoot, cryptids, Atlantis. And it feels there's a really a particular divide between the classical idea of a conspiracy theory and what we are experiencing today. Today, sort of like Q can encompass everything. Pizzagate can encompass everything. Whereas it felt a little bit before, it was kind of like, see something weird outside, slot it into the UFO. Oh, a weird animal, maybe it's a Bigfoot. In that you could kind of like, you had a set of things that were unexplained that you could sort of slot things into. And now we have a proliferation of internet theories that can just expand exponentially to have everything. And I guess my question for you is like, is the answer it's just the internet? Or is there something else at play in terms of like what kinds of information is available to people?
No, it definitely predates the internet. One of the things that's really interesting for me, I don't know, this is all interesting for me. I don't know if it's interesting to anybody else, but I found it interesting. Okay, so with conspiracy theorists, it turns out that they have a tendency to, conspiracy theories have a tendency to sort of expand like sort of like a pandemic or something, where it's just sort of like your conspiracy theory starts to take in more and more different things and it becomes a larger and larger theory that accommodates more and more crap. And like basically part of the reason is that this is a community wherein skepticism has no cultural value, right? So if you come along and you say, I believe that the government is controlled by aliens from Alpha Centauri, and they're programming our every move. And I, on the other hand, I say, well, no, the government is controlled by lizard people who live underground, right? Neither one of us really has an investment in proving the other one wrong, because there's just no joy in skepticism in this community. So it's much easier for both of us to say, maybe the lizard people are from Alpha Centauri and maybe we're both right. So there's this gradual tendency to kind of snowball different theories. And this is why, in a lot of cases, UFO belief in particular becomes the kind of gateway drug into some of these more kind of stranger and, maybe darker and maybe, a lot of times, frankly, anti-Semitic conspiracy theories sort of roll out of UFO theories, because once you start with UFO theories, you kind of open the door to believe anything. And again, that's not to say that, people believe in UFOs aren't necessarily this. But in the kind of hardcore believer networks, you see these kind of lines getting blurred often. And it's because you just have no incentive to like push back on any of these theories. And so it's not just social media. I think also I feel like where we're at right now is like really going on 50 years of various conspiracy theories, from JFK to the moon landing to Area 51, all sort of like gradually blurring and sort of expanding into kind of larger and larger, weirder and weirder, and more like disturbing conspiracy theories, I think.
You had a really good point, because I was just thinking about like, well, what happens when some conspiracy theories turn out to be semi-true? Like Jeffrey Epstein, it turns out this was all happening. And you made a really good point in the book that you were like, it's not that conspiracy theories are wrong, it's that they're half right. Right. And that sort of like half truth is what can kind of like launch it. Can you kind of tell a little bit about how conspiracies can use half truths to create themselves?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's fair to say that most of the things I write about in the book start with something that is genuinely anomalous, genuinely unknown, a story that genuinely doesn't make sense. The kind of famous story of Kenneth Arnold, who he's flying over Mount Rainier in 1947, and he sees these silver bat wing shaped flying crafts of some kind. But he follows them. He doesn't know what they are, and he's a stand-up guy. He's a well-respected guy. He's not crazy. He's not, fringe person. He comes down. He's like, look, I saw these things. Maybe they're, Soviet Union. Maybe this is an attack. I should tell somebody. So he goes and he tells, he goes to the FBI office. The FBI is closed. So it's like a weekend. The FBI don't work on the weekends. So he goes to the newspaper instead. And these two reporters take down his story. And one of the things he says is like, these clearly they are bat wing shaped, but they moved like a saucer skipped across the water. And they quote him on that in their newspaper story, which then goes out to the local Oregon press. But then they condense it down for a wire report, and the wire report kind of fumbles the description. And and it becomes about saucer-shaped objects rather than bat-wing-shaped objects that like skip like saucers. So like, and that becomes the kind of textbook, you know, UFOs. So like a lot of times these things start with something anomalous, and then the original eyewitness report or whatever becomes something that then kind of spirals out of control and gets sort of lost in the shuffle. You know, another one that I really like is this story in Lawndale, Illinois in 1977, when this woman is in the backyard with her 6-year-old son, when these, according to her, these two large birds, like prehistoric birds, swoop down and pick up her 6-year-old son and carry this child away for like 10 or 20 feet before she's able to like get them to let it go. And so she, you know, she looks, you know, she files this report, it's on the news, and she's looking at birds, and she finally decides that they were condors, which doesn't work because condors are scavengers. They don't go after living prey. They can pick up like at most a few pounds, not like a small child, which would be too heavy. And they were nearly extinct at the time, and they only lived in California. But in the wake of that event, you had like sightings all over Illinois, and it became this kind of, and a lot of those sightings were hoaxed, or they were just, you know, whatever, you know, and so it blew up into this thing that then people are like, oh, this is just a bunch of hoaxes, this is just a bunch of nonsense. But then the original idea, you know, the original event, which to me still kind of lingers, like I don't know what the heck that was, I think has, you know, gets lost in the shuffle. So right, so these things tend to start with something anomalous, and then they become about, again, they become about something that is like sort of satisfying or like some need, or sort of like assuaging some anxiety for people, and that's when they really start to take off. That was probably a long answer to your question, but
No, but it brought up a thing that I had been wanting to talk about, which is the use of newspapers in the spread of conspiracy theories. Because we worked together a little bit on a piece for Columbia Journalism Review about sort of the origins of fact checking, and you bring up that the wire services and actually sort of like the beginning of the AP are essential in a way to kind of the creation of a objective truth and fact, and that a lot of these stories tend to come through then that avenue. And I think Charles Fort starts as a journalist and kind of like ends up using a lot of these sort of very local color stories to, you know, to perpetuate a lot of his theories. Can you just talk a little bit, because I was fascinated to hear to sort of like the origins of like the wire and the origins of objective journalism.
yeah, right. So right, so when wire services are starting, the goal is to, you know, be able to sell your news to as many different local papers, regional papers as possible across the nation, and you can't do that if you have a political slant, right? You know, if you have if your wire service is just giving, you know, right-wing takes on politics, then you're not going to be able to sell them in left-wing journals, and vice versa. So the early wire report, like innovation, is this idea of, rather than be a kind of partisan news force, which was the dominant mode at the time, we're just going to give objective facts, and then, you know, right-wing partisans can spin it their way and left-wing partisans can spin it their ways. So that's kind of, yeah, as you say, that's kind of how the wire services kind of established this idea that objective journalism is sort of like a value and something worth pursuing.
So they stripped it of local color so they could sell it everywhere. But
Yeah.
then by stripping it of local color, it also made it more objective, but also could be sold better.
Right,
So
exactly.
in many
Yeah.
ways, it's like facts were like a product of capitalism, because it's like you can sell facts as an idea. It's just
Right.
like the opposite of like where we're at right now. And I thought that was very fascinating.
Yeah, exactly. Because like if you know your market, if you are in a, you know, very, I don't know, like Republican town, then you can put out a very Republican slanted newspaper and know that it will sell well. But if you're trying to sell across the country, it's kind of the lowest common denominator is just objective fact, because that's the one thing that you can sell to the most amount of people. Maybe not so much anymore, but yeah. And so, right. And, you know, so not only with, you know, the Kenneth Arnold sighting, but it turns out with a lot of these things, they spring out of, you know, wire reports, at least initially. And in part because wire reports have this, by that point, a kind of reputation for facts, that these things take on a legitimacy that they wouldn't necessarily have if somebody was just, jumping up and down about some flying saucer that they saw.
And tell me a little bit about how Charles Fort used his sort of like experience in journalism and also sort of newspapers to sort of be inspired in his work. And also,
right. So one of the kind of one of the ways in which you can talk about some of these figures is a lovely term of art, which is cranks, right? So a crank is somebody who has a very specific hypothesis, a very specific conspiracy theory or belief that they are pushing, right? So like I remember when I was a teen, there was this guy who would hang out in Northern California where I grew up, like on the main drag in like Berkeley and Santa Cruz or whatever, with this big van that said, Stephen King shot John Lennon. Evidence proves, or you win the van. And he would just, and he had this whole elaborate theory, and you could talk to him about it, and he would tell you all this crazy stuff. Now he's got a website, so you don't have to live in Northern California. You can follow his, but like it was very much like that's like the textbook crank, right? So Charles Fort, who's a journalist in the early 20th century, as he moves out of journalism into writing fiction, he also wants to write nonfiction, and he ends up writing 2 books, which are, by all accounts, crank books. Like they are books filled with sort of these weird theories that Charles Fort is advocating. One of which he never published either of them, and the manuscripts were lost. So we only know what they are through like letters that he wrote where he was describing them. But one of them was something about how human behavior was controlled by radio waves sent from the planet Mars or something like that. Anyways, he didn't get those published. So if that had been his life's work, I think we would have largely forgot about Charles Fort. But instead, what he does instead with the Book of the Damned, which he publishes in 1919, is he changes tact altogether. And instead of advocating theories, he starts just gathering up kind of anomalous and bizarre newspaper reports that he can't find a satisfactory explanation for. And so, a lot of like the thing he's most, associated with is these like accounts of rains of frogs, right? Where frogs fall from the sky, of which there are documented occurrences all throughout the world, for better, for worse. People have reported rains of frogs. And the best sort of scientific explanation is that like a water spout or tornado is moving over a pond and sucks up these frogs and then spits them back out, and it looks like rain. And Charles Fort is like, why wouldn't it also like suck up rocks and twigs and lily ponds? Why is it only exactly sucking up frogs, right? And so Charles Fort's book, The Book of the Damned, the title is this idea that these are facts that are quote unquote damned. They are excluded from science. They're excluded from mainstream conversation. They are these things, the leftover things that he keeps finding in news reports and journals that just don't fit scientific orthodoxy, and as a result are sort of cast out of the record because nobody wants to deal with them. And so the Book of the Damned becomes, again, he doesn't set out to try and explain these things, because I think if he had, the book would probably suck because his explanations would probably be lame. Instead, he just kind of presents them all to the reader in this way that becomes really compelling, because the reader doesn't have to buy or not buy Fort's, personal theories. It just becomes a way of accepting and facing the fact that there are things that we just don't have really good explanations for.
You see that it was really wonderful to read about cranks and to have cranks so perfectly defined, because you're reading about them like Oliver Wendell Holmes at like the beginning of the 20th century, and you're like, oh, these are the people I deal with every single day online. Like he's literally just describing people that you're like, yes, it's like a person who does his own thinking, who offers his own grand unified theories, a person who refuses to accept scientific dogma. And I was like, oh, literally everyone I've ever met online.
Yeah, right.
And I was wondering if there are certain, you kind of say that like certain periods of time bring the cranks out of the woodwork. And those are periods of rapid change. And sort of like it makes total sense that the early 20th century is a period of rapid change. The period we're in now, nobody knows what day it is. We are maybe in one of the most periods of the most rapid change we've ever experienced. Can you talk a little bit about sort of like what brings cranks out of the woodwork and sort of when they thrive?
Right, and I think I think there are a lot of different things that, and I think you're right. One of the things is rapid change, and particularly like chaos. And again, I mean, I think we're living through a very disturbing but illustrative moment, right? Like what happened in February basically is we knew that this pandemic was coming, but we also didn't know a lot about it because it was new, it was scary. We were getting a lot of misinformation and confused information from public health sources. And even the ones who are trying to be accurate were often saying, look, we just don't know at this point. We're trying to figure it out, but we don't know how it spreads. We don't know how to fight it. We don't know who it kills and doesn't kill, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So in that sort of moment of chaos and randomness, a lot of us were sort of like left to make up our own conclusions about these things, and do our best to sort of understand and set our belief system based on the information we had. And what seems to have happened is in the past couple of months, we've learned a lot more. We know, like, okay, yeah, like masks seem to work really well. Indoor bars are a bad idea. These drugs work, these drugs don't. And a lot of us have adjusted our attitudes and our ideas and our actions based on this new information, which is, I think, how things should be. But there are other folks who have really clung to those belief systems in defiance almost of the facts, and this sort of playing out across the country. And I think that what you see there is that people are, in times of great uncertainty and chaos, a stable explanation for the world the way it is so compelling and appealing that is worth more to some people than the objective, facts or objective record as we understand it. And I think that so in times where there's a lot of uncertainty and chaos, people will look for explanations that kind of provide a sort of simplified understanding of the world that they can cling to. And that seems to be, what's been playing out in the last 6 months, and what I kind of tried to kind of give a longer arc of history with in this book, and kind of trace through 150 years basically.
You talk a lot about the grand unified theory, and I mean, even as you were talking about like people looking for a very stable explanation, it's strange because I feel like these stable explanations are still in themselves growing and shifting and changing. It's just kind of like a different kind of stability, a stability that they've kind of clung to, but yet that also are able to shift and change. Can you just like tell us a little bit about, just like talk a little bit about the grand unified theory versus science, versus the scientific method?
Yeah, okay, so let's see, what's the best way to talk about this? So in 1955, this woman, Dorothy Martin, starts getting messages from somebody from Venus saying that the world is going to flood at the end of the year and all humanity is going to be washed away, but that it's just like responded to that comment with cool. Anyways, however, this Venusian says to Dorothy Martin, I will bring a flying saucer down and take you and your followers up. So she gathers a kind of group of like maybe a couple dozen people, one of whom turns out to be a sociologist named Leon Festinger, who has infiltrated the group, unbeknownst to them, but he's sort of studying them as a sociological phenomenon. And he coins this phrase cognitive dissonance as a result of this, which is something we still use, still a term of art and use. And basically what Festinger sees is this, is December 21st is the day of the flood. It comes and goes, and this might be a shock to some people here, but the world did not end 65 years ago, however long ago it was, and the UFO didn't come, right? So what happens to Dorothy Martin's group? Well, some people give up. Some people are like, oh, well, I guess we got it wrong, going back to my day job. The people that remain double down. They really double down on this theory, and they're they come up with various theories like, oh, we got the date wrong, but it's still happening, or we garbled the message somehow, but it's still real. And what Fessinger describes as cognitive dissonance is that when your belief system is out of line with the facts as they exist, you either change your belief system or you start to doubt and change the facts, because you need to be in a place where you see the facts as you understand them in alignment with your belief system. So the more that the facts contradict your belief system, the harder and harder you have to work to either dismiss the facts through some sort of hoax or conspiracy theory, or come up with an increasingly elaborate system which can explain the facts and why they are the way they are in a way that still affirms your belief system. So it's sort of like it arises, I think, out of that cognitive dissonance, and that is kind of the driver to these kind of increasingly elaborate versions of some of these conspiracy theories. So
I think that's a good segue into sort of the last section I want to talk about, and two of my favorite characters in the book, who are Betty and Barney Hill. I so fascinated when you first started telling me about them. So they are the two characters who sort of begin the idea of sort of like the alien abduction by sort of the gray, sexless, genderless alien. But the way that the story behind the story is fascinating, because Betty and Barney Hill are a interracial couple in like the they were married in the 40s or the 50s?
1963.
Oh, they were married in 1963.
Oh, sorry, when they're married. I forget when they're married, but yes, sorry, the event happens in
1963. So interracial couple living in New Hampshire.
Yeah.
And I'll leave it to you to tell a little bit more, but like it's a fascinating story about the abduction narrative combined with a sort of how each of them sees it, and you kind of also see the stresses of two people in an interracial marriage in 1963, and how each of them sort of understands and describes the alien abduction, and sort of whose version of the narrative ends up becoming the sort of like little gray space alien story. And you also talk a little bit in the book about the captive narrative, especially sort of like the white captive captured by Native Americans, and how popular that story is. So can you just tell me a little bit about Betty and Barney Hill? I'm going to just pop on the screen a picture of them and their dog, who are adorable.
Right, because the dog is an integral part of the story too. The dog was there when this all happened. Although
the dog was there too. Yeah, hold on.
The dog did not get abducted, but yeah.
So tell me a little bit about Betty and Barney Hill and how their story of alien abduction is understood within the context of their interracial marriage in 1963.
Sure, yeah, and again, it's a really fascinating story. And so, so as you mentioned, they're an interracial couple. They live in New Hampshire. Betty is from New Hampshire. Betty is white. She's from New Hampshire. She met Barney. Oh my gosh, look at those guys. So she met Barney doing civil rights work, and so that's how they got married. Barney, I forget where he was from, but he was from the South. So he felt out of place in New Hampshire. It was a predominantly white community. I mean, their marriage was happy by all accounts, but he was obviously a little bit out of place. And so so they have this encounter. They're driving back home from Canada, and they lose 2 hours of time somehow on the drive back. They don't know what happened. They can't account for it. And Betty's sister is a real UFO believer. So Betty's sister's like, well, maybe you guys were abducted, right? So, and Betty's like, yes, that would explain things. So she goes around telling everybody that they were abducted. And Barney is like not having it. He's really downplaying the whole thing. And one of the things that seems clear is that being a established member of this community, Betty could, for better or for worse, she could tell people that she was abducted, and it wouldn't really change their estimation of her. That maybe like, oh, well, that's a kooky thing, my friend Betty, but whatever. Whereas Barney already feels like an outsider. And so for Barney to go around and say to people, you're never going to believe this, but I was abducted by aliens, creates a further distance between him and the people that he's trying to sort of, build a community with. So he's really resistant through this. And And so it causes some marital stress, and they end up going into hypnotic therapy. And so two things are really fascinating. One is that Barney ultimately comes around, but in this very circumspect way. So at the end, he says, he doesn't say I was abducted by aliens. He says, I tell people I believe I was abducted by aliens, as though to sort of split the difference between, sort of reconciling with his wife's view of events, while also kind of acknowledging that he's sort of, a little bit on the outside of this narrative. But the other thing is that when they're describing these aliens, Barney cycles through a bunch of really interesting sort of ethnic markers to describe them. He describes them as Irish at one point. He describes them as looking like German Nazis. He describes them as, I think he describes them as Asian at certain points. And when the therapist asks him why Irish, his comment is, well, because in my experience, Irish people are hostile to Black people. So it's very like explicitly like sees the aliens in terms of sort of like, racial dynamics and sort of American racism. Whereas Betty sort of eschews all racial markings altogether. And she says basically, they were gray, as though to kind of like imagine a body and a being that had somehow transcended race. And so when you look at Betty and Barney's story, it is, whether or not you think that aliens are real, which we can totally bracket that question for the moment. Their story is very much one of an interracial couple at the height of the civil rights era, negotiating racial politics in America. And in fact, so James Earl Jones, the actor, buys the rights to their story and produces an NBC TV movie, which you can still watch on YouTube, which is great, called the UFO Experience, I think it's called.
UFO Incident?
UFO Incident, yeah, with Estelle Getty as Betty Hill. And again, when you watch the movie, I mean, James Earl Jones is, the movie is very clearly interested in using this event to talk about race in America. And it is 2 weeks after this this movie airs that the Travis Walton abduction that becomes the basis for the movie Fire in the Sky happens in Texas, and a sort of flood of alien abduction stories like floods the airways. So it's almost as though America was presented with this very obvious and explicit allegory about racial tensions and took one look at it and said, this is about UFOs.
This is about UFOs. They're like, oh, you feel othered in society? That's because of aliens.
right, exactly, yeah. So.
Yeah, no, that was fascinating. Just like, reading about like James Earl Jones being like, oh, I see a perfect allegory for race relations in America. And then everyone else is like, oh, aliens are real.
Aliens
that's just how that works out. I'm going to start looking through some of the Q&A questions because we're about 45 minutes in.
Thanks for asking. Thanks for sticking around this long.
Thank you, everyone. Okay, great. I'm gonna kind of pop through here. So, top one. What do you think motivates the Bob Lazars of the world? And my question is, who's Bob Lazar?
Bob Lazar. So Bob Lazar is the guy who, in 1989, he says, I used to work at Area 51, and it is the secret military base where we have bodies of aliens and crash UFOs. So Bob Lazar, obviously the idea that the military had, aliens was not new by that point, but Bob Lazar is the first person to argue that there's such a place as Area 51, which becomes hugely important. What motivates Bob Lazar? That seems like a really complicated question that's really hard to unpack, but certainly this was somebody who he argued that he was sort of tapped for really high profile, top secret scientific work as a result of his genius, when in fact he had, I think, barely finished community college or something like that. And does that play a little bit into it? It's possible. I mean, his arguments, again, like at first you're like, well, okay, I believe in secret military bases. Maybe there's something going on. But in order for Bob Lazar to sort of continue his sort of argument, it got increasingly elaborate in order to maintain the conspiracy. So like one of the things I'm always asking with conspiracy theories is like, we know actual conspiracies like Watergate, for example. Watergate came undone in part because Woodward and Bernstein went to the secretaries, right, and started asking the foot soldiers, because the guys in the pinstripe suits don't take out their own trash, they don't cook their own meals, right? And so so with Area 51, you're like, okay, sure, I imagine, top secret military brass are in on this, but they're like, what about the janitors? What about the cafeteria guys? Like somebody's going to talk, right? And so Bob Lazar has to sort of account for this. And so he tells this story, for example, of in 1978, there was a meeting between the government scientists and the aliens, and there was a misunderstanding, and the aliens pulled out their laser guns and liquidated 50 government scientists, just killed them, right? Sounds sad for those guys, sad for their family.
Sad.
And so the immediate question is, what about their families? Where were the obituaries? Why didn't anybody?
Show me the obituaries.
Yeah, why, and so Bob Lazar has to come back and say, okay, well, what happened is the government goes around to orphanages and selects orphans without parents or without any family ties who show strong intellectual prowess, and abducts them from orphanages in order to train them to be scientists. So it's just like one of these things where it's like at first it sort of makes sense, but in order to sustain it, it gets weirder and weirder. And what motivates that, I don't know, but I have a hard time believing in the orphan liquidated government scientists narrative, I guess.
Yeah, also, is there like a lot of liquid? Who cleaned it all up? Seems kind of gross.
Right, like somebody
is it on the walls?
Like, on his deathbed being like, look, I've kept it until now, but look, I was a janitor, I saw some terrible stuff, I'm gonna die anyways, what's the worst?
It's basically a lot of goo, floors, walls, goo gone, not gonna fix it.
Yeah.
The next question is actually something I think a lot about, of sort of the common thread through a lot of your books. And in many ways, as I think that between Ghostland and the Unidentified, there's a very distinct common thread in that you were basically trying to figure out, like, what are the stories we tell? Why do we tell ourselves these stories about haunted houses, and why do we tell ourselves these stories about conspiracy theories? And I think something like the Betty and Barney Hill case is a perfect example of sort of like how, a small, maybe interpersonal story can become writ large. But tell me a little bit about sort of like the common threads that you see about like what you're looking to do in at least these two books.
I mean, I think it's just basically the fact that I think a lot of this stuff we dismiss because it's like hokum, and we're not primed to take it seriously. And I think my interest is in whether or not these things are real or not. I mean, I try to be agnostic about ghosts. I don't know if ghosts are real or not. But whether or not they're real or not, they affect culture, they affect history, they affect the way the world moves. UFO belief, rightly or wrongly, has affected American culture in significant material ways. And so my interest is primarily in these fringe things that don't otherwise get discussed, but nevertheless have an impact on the world. And I think it's worth taking that impact seriously, even if you don't necessarily sign up for the beliefs themselves.
Yeah, I think a lot about how there's the iconic haunted house is like the Victorian haunted house, but we don't think about like the Great Panic of like 1873 that like created a bunch of houses that no one lived in. Like there are like financial, economic, like there are reasons behind these myths. And I think you just do such an amazing job of explaining, like, if someone has a thought or a feeling or a belief, there's a reason for it. And so you're like, I just have to get to the root of that reason. I think that's why these two books work so well together. And I think, so one of these questions here is, I'm guessing neither of you saw a ghost, huh? And you have been ghost hunting. So can you just talk a little bit about that experience?
I have been ghost hunting. I've seen various anomalous stuff, but I don't know that I've seen anything that is a cool enough story to be told. Like I've talked to people who have like told me stuff, like really like amazing specific things that they saw that I was like, wow, that's amazing. I've seen videos of things that I can't explain. I have not myself had an experience where I was unable to. It's not that I was sure it wasn't something. I just wasn't sure it was something. If that makes any sense. What about you, Michelle?
I mean, the most can you hear me? Yes. The most frightening experience I've ever had was with you and Boo Bear, the ghost hunting bear, who definitely can commune with the dead. And we had a seance at the Morbid Anatomy Museum with Boo Bear. And I'm not saying he touched the veil, but I think he might have.
Yeah, Boo Bear. We'll bring him on the call next time we do this. We should have Boo Bear.
Yeah, can you just explain what Boo Bear is?
Boo Bear is a ghost hunting teddy bear. He has a K2 meter embedded in him, which is a thing that picks up radio waves. So apparently, particularly ghosts of children will respond to stuffed animals and toys. So the idea is if you embed a K2 meter inside a teddy bear, you might get better readings. So Boo Bear's paw will light up red, apparently, if there's ghostly activity. So you set Boo Bear in a room and you talk to him and his paw lights up.
I just want to let you know that I will be haunting you through Boo Bear come the future. So prepare yourself. Another question here is, okay, so why do so many conspiracy theories have anti-Semitic slants? Kind of figuring out sort of the other and conspiracy theories.
Yeah, I mean, and again, we talked about this a little bit earlier, but part of the problem is that when you are primed to be credulous, you disincentivize people pushing back from the more outlandish and frankly racist conspiracy theories. So, again, if somebody is like, I believe that lizard people control the world, and somebody else says, I believe that the Jews control the world, then it's really easy for them both to say, oh, well, the Jews are lizard people or other garbage nonsense like that. So that's part of the reason. Is it just conspiracy theory belief as a sort of structure is open to or it's at least it does a very poor job of defending itself from sort of infiltration by racism, and that is true particularly of like UFO culture, which again is about this idea of like sort of the otherness, like a being which is sort of hidden and sort of like physically weak but somehow technologically superior and is sort of parasitic in a way. And it's and in the 80s, a lot of that belief is not just directed towards Jewish culture, but also sort of the height of Japanophobia and this idea that like, the abducting aliens of the 80s often sort of bore a disturbing similarity to American sort of, not very veiled hostility and racism towards Japanese culture. So that just becomes a kind of facet, which is depressing and obnoxious and something that I think if you're going to subscribe to any of these beliefs, you really have to be militant towards keeping that kind of garbage out of the acceptable bounds of conversation.
One of the next questions is, I think, a question a lot of us think about is, did you gain any insight while working on in this book about how people can lose faith in conspiracy theories, given all the evidence to the contrary? And there were a couple, you said something that was just like, it's not what people believe, it's that they believe. And one thing I kind of wanted to kind of wrap up with was, you have a quote in the section about the UFOs that basically you're like, okay, so during an initial period of belief, large amounts of people are attracted to phenomena because it has, yet to be debunked. But once it's debunked, potential believers fall away, but those who remain strengthen their beliefs.
Yeah.
And that felt very, are you explaining what life is like right now in, the end of July 2020? Can you talk a little bit about either sort of about both the ways, sort of like how to talk with a person who has these beliefs and maybe how to sway them or understand them, but then also how these beliefs ultimately people leave them or fall away from them?
Yeah, so I mean, like a lot of people, 5 years ago, I was the guy who on Facebook, somebody would post some sort of ridiculous conspiracy theory, like a cousin or like a coworker or something like that. And I would be the guy in the comments, with the factual correction, and it would devolve into a shouting match. And at some point I realized, it actually doesn't work to just give these people the facts. And the conclusion that I've come to is that you need to understand the belief that, or the fear or the anxiety that is driving these conspiracy theories, and sort of figure out what is that conspiracy theory doing for that person, and what can you do to sort of diffuse that conspiracy theory, by getting to the belief or the insecurity or the anxiety or whatever that's at the root of it. And I think that involves sort of like acknowledging those things, like acknowledging, for example, like, like skepticism about government, skepticism about like big pharma. I mean, like, I think that like, like you take, like, I don't talk about anti-vaxxers in the book, but like, anti-vaxxers, A, vaccinate your kids. B, they're motivated by a set of concerns which are not at their root irrational or illogical. It's just the expression that they finally get to is often problematic. And so it's really, for me, about doing the slow work of trying to understand, what people are actually seeking when they find these conspiracy theories, and then sort of trying to figure out what is going on there and how you can sort of manage that in a way that then allows them to kind of let go of those theories.
We just have a few minutes left, and I just wanted to ask you a little bit about the people that you approached, that you write about in the book, in sort of the field notes section, and sort of like how you approached them, how you talked with them, how you engaged with them. Just tell me about some of those interactions, and maybe some of them that were a little hard to get through.
Yeah, I mean, I talked to a lot of people, and most of them were great. They were lovely. They were giving of their time. I mean, people told me amazing stuff that I was happy to report. Like they'd seen lights in the sky, and I'm certainly not in a position to say, no, you didn't, or what you saw was not, was a helicopter or something. So I've really tried my best to just sort of, report what I've been told, and, as graciously and generously as I could. Particularly when I went to Mount Shasta, which is supposedly the home of the lost city of Telos, where the Lemurians live. And everybody in Mount Shasta has a story one way or another. And it's a weird, fascinating place that I opened the book with, because I really felt like it set the kind of tone for the possibility of these things. There were a couple of people who pushed on me pretty dark theories, one of whom told me something that I'm sorry, I don't mean to be coy here, but I kind of dropped my jaw, and then 5 minutes later he came up to me and he said, don't put that in the book, okay? And so I honored his request a little bit, but also I was like, that is the worst thing I have heard anybody tell me in my adult life. So like,
Was it, are our ears gonna bleed? Are we gonna die? Is this like The Ring, if you tell us?
I mean, I'm being obnoxious here by saying like, no, I'm not going to tell you, because I was asked not to tell people, and B, it's not suitable for all audiences. We'll say that. But so yeah, so definitely I heard some
Is it
stuff.
about Hillary? Is it about Hillary Clinton? Is it about
no, strangely it was not. Although certainly I heard plenty about Hillary Clinton. So yeah, anyways, so that's a non-answer to that question. Sorry.
All right, let's see. Do we have any sort of like final questions in here? Oh, so one final question. Someone asked about cognitive dissonance, but does Dunning-Kruger also play a part in the prevalence and adoption of conspiracy theories? Do other cognitive biases play a major role? And you talk a lot about looking and finding patterns. And can you talk a little bit about that, sort of like people finding patterns versus like using the scientific method?
Yeah. Oh, yeah. So definitely. So years ago, I wrote a piece actually for you, Michelle, when you were working at Lapham's Quarterly on Nostradamus. And one of the things I came across in this piece I was researching it, is a study folks did about 10 years ago, where they showed people two images. One image had just a bunch of visual static, just a bunch of lines. And the other one had the same visual static, but hiding behind the lines was a drawing of something. I think it was like a hat, just like a simple line drawing of a hat. So you show the one with the hat and you say, do you see anything? And people say, yeah, I see a hat. And then you show the other one that's just visual static, say, do you see anything? And some people are like, no, I just see lines. And other people are like, yes, I see a car, I see a cat, whatever. So then they do a sort of psychological workup of the people who saw something in the image that had nothing. And it turns out that those people, according to research, are people who, one way or another, felt their own personal lives to be out of control. So either financially or emotionally or romantically, whatever. And so the conclusion that they come to is that when you perceive life to be chaotic, or you feel your life is out of control, one of the coping mechanisms that we have is to look for patterns where none exist. So you start looking for things that like sort of provide a framework or a sort of matrix or something to explain the world because it feels random and chaotic. And so I think that is another sort of driver for a lot of this stuff. So.
Okay, and then just to wrap up, Colin, what is your favorite conspiracy theory?
I mean, it's really hard, honestly, because
it's one that you're like, I like looking into it, or I think it's real. Like,
I mean, I as I mentioned this earlier, I really do love the guy who thinks that Stephen King shot John Lennon. I think there's something sort of, I mean, I honestly, I feel bad for Mr. King, who obviously does not need this, and but he's doing well, he's fine. I think he's insulated himself pretty well from the weirdos of the world. But I think there's something very pure and all of very delightful about this guy who goes around Santa Cruz in a van trying to argue that Stephen King was hired by the CIA to murder John Lennon for whatever reason. So as I said, I met that guy when I was like 15 or 16, and he's always had a kind of special place in my heart.
I really like that Beyonce is not Black, that she's actually Italian, and that she's like her actual name is like Jean-Marie Strassa or something. Yeah. And so like not only is she like Illuminati, she's also Italian. That's my favorite conspiracy.
Yeah, that's a good one. That's a really good one. Yeah.
All right, thank you, Colin. The book is again, I'm gonna do it like look, I'm an influencer. It's The Unidentified. There are so many good stories in this book. I mean, it's one of those things where like, I'll just be reading it and be like, wait, hold on, and have to tell everyone about this like new story. Like, for instance, I didn't realize that like Japan would send weather balloons with bombs, and they would like go all the way over the Pacific Northwest and get all the way to Detroit. And that's why people were like originally terrified of UFOs. I was like, oh shit, I just learned something from Colin. So if you read The Unidentified, you will learn insane tidbits that you'll be able to bring up at the next dinner party in 2021.
Yeah, right, exactly. Whenever there's a dinner party.
Whenever there's a dinner party ever again.
I should say quickly, if you have a question that we didn't get a chance to answer, you can hit me up on Twitter, Instagram, because
yes,
I talk about this stuff until the cows either come home or are mutilated. So.
Please. Oh God, I didn't even get to the mutilated cows. That was one of my questions. If you find Colin on Twitter, hound him, harass him, make sure you DM him a lot, and he will answer your questions. Thank you so much, Colin. I'm happy that you've gone Sasquatchian, and thanks a lot. I'll talk to you again very soon, and thank you all.
Thank you to Politics and Prose. Thank you to Michelle for doing this. This was a lot of fun. Thanks for everybody who showed up.
Thanks all. Bye-bye.